Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. This is part 10 of our study on the Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies 10-month report leak. Okay, this was not put out by the government. This leaked online. And George Knapp, who co-wrote two books with the former director of OSAP and the former operations manager of OSAP, probed the authenticity of this leak. And so we're trying to study it by giving it context, its historical context, so in order to understand what it's actually saying. Now, we're going to do that in this episode, but I want to start here. So, Diana Pasulka, who's a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, wrote this excellent book that was published by Oxford University Press called Encounters, right? And what I find very fascinating is this specific passage in page 149, where she says the following. I'd interviewed for my previous research. Okay, scientists I'd interviewed for my previous research indicated that much of UFO data is transmitted through an oral tradition and not written down. Tyler had referenced a term that he indicated was in use among the circles of scientists in which he was involved. Pencils up. It meant that none of the information should be written. This was to preserve its secrecy, but also to maintain the data in the bodies and minds of those who received it. Okay, pencils up. So there is a pencil, according to Diana Pasulka, there is a pencils up tradition within these legacy UFO programs, these secret UFO programs. Okay. And it's not written down, right? It's passed on by word of mouth. And this is in order to maintain its secrecy, right? Because you cannot FOIA a secret oral tradition. Okay. You can't FOIA that. Um, and that's not something, this is passed on within a skiff, let's say. It's not something the Chinese would be able to pick up or verify if they did, right? Because just because something is said doesn't mean it's true. And you would like some additional evidence to corroborate this thing being said. But yeah, so some of this information by the scientists who study this on the down low for the government or private contractors is passed on orally in order to maintain its secrecy. Okay. Now, I'm going to show how this relates to the contents of this 10-month report. But before I do that, I need to give context to where I'm getting this information because I believe I have identified one of these oral traditions, one of these nuggets of information. Um, and I can't prove I'm right, but there's evidence to support my assertion. And I'm going to show how it influenced part of what's in this report and part of the trajectories were taken in studying the UFO phenomenon on behalf of the Department of Defense or the Defense Intelligence Agency. Okay. But before I go into that, I have to give contextual background. Okay. So that's Colonel John Alexander. Back in the 80s, he convened something called the Advanced Theoretical Physics Conference. I think it's interesting that advanced theoretical physics could be made into an acronym of ATIP if you wanted to. I think it's an interesting thing to point out. But this was from 1985. These are the Oak Shannon notes, which were also leaked online. Oak Shannon was a scientist in attendance. Who used to work at Los Alamos, I believe. And you see some of the participants of this conference, right? You have John Alexander, who you see here. You have Val Puthoff, who we met in episode 8 of this series. And then you have others, right? So these others who aren't official attendees, you have McDonnell Douglas, person, and you have a Lockheed Martin little contingent. Okay. This shouldn't surprise us based on what we learned in previous episodes. Now, one in particular is Ron Blackburn. Now, Ron Blackburn was an officer in the U.S. Air Force. I believe he's a lieutenant colonel, and he served his country honorably for 20 years in the Air Force, and after that went to private industry, which is a career path that a lot of people take. Now, Forbidden Science, Jacques Vallée's published journals for this entry in Cinco de Mayo, 1990. He says the following. Okay. Ron Blackburn gave the Lockheed viewpoint. Okay, so we established through this that um, Ron Blackburn, perhaps in an unofficial or official capacity, represented Lockheed Martin in this Advanced Theoretical Physics conference, which, by the way, was all about UFOs. Okay, this was UFO related. But Ron Blackburn gave the Lockheed viewpoint. When he joined the Skunk Works in Burbank, he worked with a scientist named Paul Tyler, who encouraged him to investigate UFOs from the point of view of energy, consciousness, and form, where form is negotiable. Ron believes that Roswell was a true crash with bodies. Okay. Now, who is this Paul Tyler? Well, there's this thing called the Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute, and they basically study the effects of radiation on the human body. Paul Tyler was apparently a program manager at the time this specific report was put out. You can find it online. Effect of radiation on human health effects on ionizing radiation. Okay. He also wrote an interesting paper. He was a captain, apparently, the electromagnetic spectrum and low intensity conflict. Okay. And it's funny that this report, the forward, this whole this whole publication, which has various essays, the forward was given by Congressman Newt Gingrich. Uh, by the way, I shook Newt Gingrich's hand a long time ago on accident when I was at CPAC when they were in Orlando. Anyways, Ron Blackburn gave the Lockheed viewpoint, like I said, and here's the form. Okay, here's the chunk that I want to focus on. Energy, consciousness, and form, where form is negotiable. Okay, and I think that's the form that and that's the form. That's a formula that's being passed down. Okay, and what we have here in the case of Jacques Vallée's journal is an oral tradition. Okay, it's an oral tradition. Paul Tyler told Ron Blackburn, and Ron Blackburn told Jacques Vallée, and Jacques Vallée wrote it down. This is like an Islamic isnad. An isnad is a chain of transmission that goes from the person quoting the Prophet Muhammad. And okay, so say something like, you know, I'm making this up. This is not up. I'm not Muslim. I've just read tangentially about this. But let's say, for example, like uh, Abdullah ibn Rashid heard, Malik ibn al-Hassan say that, Abu Bakr told him that he heard that Muhammad, the prophet, praise peace be upon him, said da 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 da. Okay, that's an isnad. Okay, so it's basically a chain of transmission of an oral tradition. Okay, and these are called hadiths, right? Hadiths are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that are not in the Quran because the Quran is God's word through him, right? But the hadith is this Muhammad talking, okay? And these hadiths, these oral sayings, they have to be backed up, right? Because if you're, living, 70 years later, 100 years later, and you're writing this down, where did you get it, right? So you say, like, this guy told me he heard it from this guy who heard it from this guy that the prophet said, right? And then, again, I'm not Muslim, but from what I understand, because I had Muslim friends when I was in college, you know, um, some Muslims, Salafists, they try to base their religion on not just the Quran, but what Prophet said, Prophet's companions, and then the companions of the companions, right? So if you have a hadith, okay, I'm extrapolating here, that comes from the companions of the companions, or the companion of the prophet, right? Or, going back to the prophet, that's really kind of uh, reliable according to Salafists, right? And if you're Muslim and you're watching this and I butchered it, please comment and correct me. I'm sorry. That's my basic understanding of an isnad, right? So you have that chain of transmission here. Okay. I'm giving it to you right now. It's in Jacques Vallée's published journal, and he got it from Ron Blackburn, and Ron Blackburn got it from Paul Tyler while they were working at Lockheed Skunk Works. And this is the form, okay? Energy, consciousness, and form, where form is negotiable. That's the formula. Now, what's interesting to me is like if you read studies about the historical Jesus and you have scholars trying to like parse what he most likely taught versus what was added later. Because remember, Mark was written in 70, so that's, you know, uh, 40 years after the fact. And then Luke and Matthew are based on Mark, and they were written in like the 80s, 90s, depending. And then, John, the Gospel of John, which is this total outlier, was written in the 90s or the 100s. And then you have the Gospel of Thomas, right, which is only Jesus sayings, right? And Gospel of Thomas has a lot of these shared sayings with the synoptic gospels, Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Okay. There's like this core that the synoptics share with Thomas, right? But then there's stuff in Thomas that isn't found in any of the other gospels, right? The same thing is true about John, right? There's John, Jesus quotes in John that aren't found in any of the other gospels, and Luke quotes Jesus. He has quotes that aren't found in any other gospels, right? And so there's this criterion. Some scholars believe in called the criterion of multiple attestation, right? So the idea is that if you have multiple texts from different parts of the world, right, and they're written in the first century, let's say, and they're quoting Jesus. And if you have a saying that's found in a majority of those, right? And not just the Gospels or apocryphal stuff like Gospel of Thomas, but like the church fathers, right? If you have, these sayings in multiple sources, that's more likely than not that the historical Jesus said that or something very close to it, right? Because the historical Jesus was speaking almost certainly in Aramaic. And then so you have to account for not just oral transmission, but also language jump from Aramaic to Greek, right? So whatever oral tradition is being passed on from the original Jewish Christians to the Greek converts, there has to undergo a translation jump, right, from Aramaic to Greek. Maybe. So I say maybe because I'm not an expert. Okay. But the point I'm trying to make is that when not only do you have multiple independent attestation, but also the form critics will say that like um, things that are easy to memorize are more likely to have come from the historical Jesus. So this would be a lot of the parables, right? Like parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, the mustard seed, the leaving the 99 sheep to find the one sheep, all these different parables that are easy to memorize, right, and easy to transmit orally. These are most likely coming from the historical Jesus, especially when they're attested in multiple sources. Okay. Now, what does that have to do with this? Okay. So I think I found the form. Okay. Energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable. So that's a formula that's coming from this oral tradition. So it is formulaic. Okay, it's easier to remember, right? Energy, consciousness, and form, or form is negotiable. Okay, or you can just say energy, consciousness, and form, right? That's something that would be easy to transmit from one person to the next. Okay. Now, the other thing is, do we have multiple attestation for this oral tradition, right? Um, if you look at my screen, you would say, oh, you only have Jacques Vallée's published journal. But I think I found an attestation of this basic form, okay? And it comes from none other than Dr. Jim Ryder, former vice president of Lockheed Martin Space Systems. Okay? And if you go back to episode 8, You'll remember that this is the same Jim Ryder who represented Lockheed in the attempted tech transfer of a non-human craft, a non-human technology from Lockheed Martin. Okay, recovered technology from recovered hardware from Lockheed Martin to Bigelow Aerospace, and that this tech transfer was blocked by the CIA. Now, context. This is from a talk given at Lucis Trust, okay, the Arcane School. So Lucis Trust is this educational group that teaches theosophy as it was taught by Anne Bailey. Okay. So theosophy, you don't know if you don't know what theosophy is, it was this kind of philosophical tradition started by Madame Blavatsky, and basically it melded Western kind of Judeo-Christian esotericism with Eastern, okay, the Dharmic, the Hindu Buddhist esotericism, right? So you had like this merger of like Hindu Buddhist mystical thought with Judeo-Christian mystical thought, okay, in theosophy, right? And theosophy also had its own original insights as well. But Anne Bailey had her own way of teaching it, and that's what Lucis Trust is. So, and the Arcane School is a distance learning program that Lucis Trust has. So, if you want to learn theosophy the way Anne Bailey taught it, you can do their distance learning thing. So, here we go. Now, pay close attention. Remember, the formula, okay, that's transmitted orally is energy, consciousness, and form. Energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable. Okay, that's what we get from Jacques Vallée's journal. And you will see that Jim Ryder, he describes the UFO phenomenon in exactly those terms. Okay. Once he's prompted to talk about the Rendlesham incident. Okay. So he's talking about UFOs at this Lucis Trust thing. He's already retired. And this is also before the New York Times ATIP bombshell article, right? Um, so he's talking about UFOs at Lucis Trust, and the co-host, right, of this talk, he prompts him. So tell us about Randlesham. And what you'll hear is he'll describe Randlesham and then the UFO topic in toto in terms of energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable, and in that exact order. Okay. So let's have a listen to the late great Dr. Jim Ryder. And just as an aside, if for some very unlikely and probable chance that any of Jim Ryder's family is watching this, I just want to say that this guy seems like the coolest guy to have ever known, right? Like, I wish this guy was my grandpa. Okay, it might be bad to say that, you know. Well, my paternal grandfather died when I was like 2 years old. Okay, so this guy just seems like a cool guy who had a wealth of knowledge, and you can see that in the way he interacts with the co-host. So without further ado, Dr. Jim Ryder.
Brendel Forest.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a very good example of how cultural conditioning can fool the senses and make you interpret something that is actually different to what you first think.
Yes, it's a forest incident. It goes back in England. This picture here is giving some indication in England where it was. You can look it up on Wikipedia and all sorts of other things, get all sorts of nice arguments. But one of the keys in it, and it has been done with others, is people believing that I've seen a solid object. So remember the pictures of the flying saucers. And you certainly do see things. And the reason I put in the two drawings and the photograph is that you can draw what you thought, but interesting enough, you can take a picture of it too. So whatever it is not just in one's mind or something else. And the question that I'm referring to is when we talked that they were convinced, some of the investigators, they did feel metal. There was, quote, a ship there.
Just to set the scene, they were working in a laboratory or
No,
something?
oh, that's right, working in a forest.
In a forest,
right.
Yeah.
And where the investigators were sent to really go study it, because it was still there. And to their surprise, they did see a bright object that appeared like a UFO, and they tried to touch it, and reported it was metal.
These were scientists.
These are highly trained technical people.
They just sound a little bit silly to me. I mean, would you, if you saw a bright glowing object landing in the forest, would you go up and touch it?
If you're a scientist, yeah. I might have.
I would get the technicians to do it. Okay.
No, they did. What I did in that case is ask the question to the investigators, go back and ask them a different question. Don't ask them if they touched and felt metal. Ask them, did they feel like there was a pressure on their hand, and did the pressure get greater? So to make a long story short, that investigation was done. And it came back with the answer that actually they don't think now they did feel metal. What they felt was that the closer they got their hand to the light, the more resistance until they reached the point that the light was glowing around their hand and they could not make their hand go any further, like it was resisted. And as they put their hand away, it got less resistant. And that's changed how people do research studies on this now. You begin to realize that maybe we thought it was a solid object, like our first quotes, but now we realize that it's not a solid object.
I don't know if it occurred in this incident, but certainly in other ones like that, there's been a lot of severe burning through contact with them that you
Yes,
mentioned.
there has been, and it's, I guess the best I can say that the technical scientific world does not know what to do with that because it's outside of the, and at the very end of this, and maybe after even people ask questions, I'm going to give some comments of some very leading scientists, Max Planck Institute, many others that some of you may know the names of, who in the last 3 or 4 years have just completely changed their concepts about what is going on this planet. And you'll find that it is very close to the ageless wisdom, actually.
So we are moving into the era that when we are starting to open up to the idea of inner dimensions, at least, where or phenomena that science certainly can't explain. But to my mind, anyway, the whole idea of explaining it through some form of panpsychism or the aliveness of all things, of the diva hierarchies and the organisational aspect of them, makes a lot more sense than visitors on the physical plane from Andromeda and Captain Zob of the Galactic Federation that you sort of see all over the internet. But apart from anything else, from the perspective of the ageless wisdom, apart from anything louder, apart from anything else...
Can't hear either of us? Yell.
Apart from anything else that's... the idea of extraterrestrials on the physical plane, abductions and these kind of things, they just don't fit in to the way that the ageless wisdom portrays the life that evolves on all the various suns and planets in the universe, because each of them, each logos has a ring pass knot, and it's not going to be violated by alien adventures from other planets. If we look at, we know from the ageless wisdom that every planet in our solar system is teeming with life. It's just at a frequency, it's at a frequency that our 5 senses can't register. And there is often an isolation period where the race on a different planet has to grow through its own sense of discrimination. Otherwise we just become automatons. And so the whole idea of hostile aliens abducting people and experimenting on them just seems wrong from that point of view. But when you get into the whole idea of the psychic world, then it can be explained by many things. But the alien abductions, I think you've got something to say about.
It probably always, I'm sure many of you have read about abductions. The other strange one is whoever the abductors are, often abduct women, they impregnate them, and then they have these strange UFO human babies. No one's ever discovered one of those, by the way. And then the women who go through this in modern times have referred to that they sometimes get taken up again to feed the child. And they actually describe that. Interestingly enough, people who have been moved out of their rooms and flown out the window, women who've gone through that, have actually been investigated in sealed rooms where they go to bed and sleep, and the room is locked from the outside. There are no windows in it, there are no doors in it, and they have cameras on them all the time. And those people do experience what I just described while in the room, and the cameras and all of the sound pickups show nothing happened in the room except she snored or he snored that night. So whatever's happening is not happening physically. And it's also been shown that those same descriptions go back 25 to 30,000 years, certainly back to Roman times. In fact, if I could summarize on UFOs, a few comments that one of the great explorers in this field is Jacques Vallée, who's actually an American. He's actually an astrophysicist, and he studied this for a long time. And some of the senior leaders in this field are actually astrophysicists, so they do know a lot about stars and planets. And as he summarized, the UFOs are not objects nor flying. It's an unidentified flying object. But they're not an object and it's not flying, because an object is something that I can hit. You know, the light beam is not an object, but you can't do that with them. And they're not flying because you never actually see them flying. They appear. So that's why I use UAPs. It's an aerial, it's a phenomena, and it's unexplained. But it isn't flying, and it's not an object. So there's some other odd things. If you study the Old Testament and the Bible, there are numerous things. The burning bush, certain angel encounters. In antiquity, we called those gods and goddesses. If you study the medieval times, the same things, except the saucer wasn't saucer-shaped, it was shaped like a chariot. And it didn't have lights rotating around like that. It had lights in the front, lights in the back, and lights on the horses, and they flew through the sky like that. And they also have descriptions of women being abducted into the chariots and impregnated by the gods in the chariots. So it's the same story all the time. But in the medieval times, they called it magic, magicians. And in the 19th century, it founded new religions. And some said it was scientific geniuses. And because of time, I won't go into the religions, but
I gotta laugh because, oh my God, like he's just opening a bunch of cans of worms and then he pulls back because he realizes it.
Forest.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. Okay,
And I think
so let's go back. I love it. This is such a fun topic. Okay, so let's go back to the slideshow. Let's go back. So, okay. Um, yeah, that's such a great presentation he gave. But again, I remind you, okay, oral tradition, Jacques Vallée received from Ron Blackburn of the Skunk Works, and Paul, who received it from Paul Tyler, right? So, Jacques Vallée heard it from Ron Blackburn, who heard it from Paul Tyler at the Skunk Works, that we should study UFOs from the perspective of energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable. Okay. And then we have the VP of Lockheed Martin Space Works, Jim Ryder, who we talked about more in episode 8. And he's telling us basically the same thing, right? When he's describing, right, UFOs starting at Rendlesham, he talks about energy, okay, him and his co-host, and he talks about it being he talks about resistance, he talks about light, him and his co-host talk about, heat and injuries, and that being in contrast to solidity, right? So there we have energy. When he talks about abductions, he talks about it in terms of consciousness, right? He cites some kind of study that was done where, an abductee, right, a contactee is put in a room, they have cameras everywhere. They claim to have an abduction experience, but it turns out that they never physically left the room. And then he talks about the UFO phenomenon in terms of form, okay, where the form is negotiable, right? Today we talk about flying saucers and eggs, but in antiquity they talked about flying chariots, okay? So this is evidence, I think. This is a multiple attestation of this formula of energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable, and no less it's coming from the former vice president of Lockheed Martin, where the tradition is supposed to have originated. Okay, so you have once again Paul Tyler of Lockheed, and then James Ryder of Lockheed. Okay, and this tradition that we get from Valet comes from Ron Blackburn, who got it from Paul Tyler when they were working at the Skunk Works, and again, the head of Lockheed Martin, when he's talking about UFOs, once he's prompted to, starting with the Randlesham incident, he talks about energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable. I mean, he basically fleshes out, right? This formula is acting as kind of like the bookshelf, okay, for the outline. Okay, this formula is acting as the outline for the content of the information he's giving us. Okay, energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable. Okay, so I think I've not only have I found a multiple independent attestation of this tradition, of this form, right? This formula, but um, I think that not only did I find multiple attestation, but I also have kind of basically identified the tradition for it, right? Um, Now, back to the boss 10-month report. Okay, how is this reflected in the 10-month report? Let's talk about energy, right? Um, you can pause the video if you like and read for yourself, but here's the abstract to the DIRD. Eric Davis rule on extracting energy from the quantum vacuum, right? Um, yeah, it's all about, what is this? It's what we call, what is 0 point energy, right? Concepts for extracting energy from that. That's energy, okay? You have this one by Kit Green about anomalous acute and subacute field effects on human biological tissues, right? So this is all about, again, you can pause this and read it if you like, this abstract, but this is all about injuries people suffered from getting in close contact to UFOs, burns and that sort of thing. And so the idea is, according to this DIRD, that you can get on the DIA FOIA website. You can read this for yourself on the DIA FOIA website. Um, but what Kit Green is essentially arguing is that if we understand the kinds of injuries people get from coming in close contact to UFOs, you can reverse engineer, okay, or at least have an idea of what the propulsion system would be. Okay, what kind of propulsion system would cause these kind of injuries should you get close to them, right? Um, so again, there's energy. Okay. And then in terms of consciousness, I go back to previous episodes where we talked about project engagement. Okay. If you go back to my previous episode on project engagement, you can see that part of VOS, what they did was use alumni from the CIA psychic spy program. Okay. Tried and tested psychic spies from that 20-year program in order to make contact with non-human intelligence. Okay, so there's your consciousness aspect of it. Um, and then form, where form is negotiable. Again, I talked about this in a previous episode. Okay, you can pause and read it if you'd like. But there was a UFO that was seen by 5 different people only because they had the ITT Generation 3 night vision binoculars. Without these special night vision binoculars, they would not have been able to see the UFO. However, even though they were using the same exact binoculars, when they reported what they saw, you know, they all saw something different. Okay. Uh, the BAS administrator, which is Bob Bigelow, okay, and a U.S. Air Force colonel saw a rectangular object. Okay. A USN military officer saw a round object. A Marine saw an oval object. And a security guard saw a large diamond shaped object. Okay. They were all together. They were all using the same goggles, but they each saw a different shape. And highlighted is this part of the report that says, quote, these kinds of perceptual discrepancies may potentially provide an unparalleled research opportunity for consciousness interaction with intelligences slash operators of technology that have a long history of interacting with both people and animals on the Utah property. In other words, form. This is your form, where form is negotiable. Okay. So there you go, right? All those aspects of the formula, okay, this oral tradition are found within this leaked Boss report. Okay. Okay. Energy, consciousness, and form, where the form is negotiable. Okay. So that school of thought, and remember, Jacques Vallée was part of Boss, and uh, and Jim Ryder was talking to them the whole time, right? Um, Trying to set up that tech transfer. Okay. So that's it for today. We found the formula. We found a formula passed down orally. It's part of these, secret UFO programs by these scientists that have been studying UFOs on the down low for decades. And I found the multiple independent attestation for it. Okay. Where that formula acts as the outline for how Jim Ryder, former VP of Lockheed Martin, who tried to transfer non-human technology to Bigelow Aerospace, um, talked about UFOs, and he talked about it in terms of in the exact same terms of that formula that's passed down orally from Paul Tyler to Ron Black to Jacques Vallée, and that is energy, consciousness, and form. Form is negotiable. Okay. Very interesting. I wish I could talk more about it, but I want to keep these videos short. Until then, as always, remember, consciousness is not classified. Consciousness is not classified. It doesn't matter how many UFOs they hide in some underground base. It doesn't matter how many secrets they hide from you. The most mysterious secret of all is literally what you experience every day from the time you were born. Okay. And that is your awareness, the awareness of awareness, and the awareness of the awareness of awareness. Okay. Study that, experiment with that, and you'll understand far more about existence and the UFO topic than by any other way. Night.